Okay, welcome Zambian Master students. The title of this video is going to be Things I Wanted to Bring to Africa, but I just couldn't possibly do that, or something like that. I have my own little miniature Bible museum and things related to what we'll be talking about in class. And so I want to show you some things, and my friend Gil Gillis, who's been to Zambia, and some of you met Gil, and some of you have recorded with Gil in his studio. But Gil is videoing this, and I'm going to show you some things that I wish I could put in my suitcase and bring with me, but we're just not going to be able to do that. I want to talk in this first little clip about Greek manuscripts. We're talking bibliology, and of course a big part of that, as you know, are the Greek manuscripts, and there's so much we could cover. I want to focus really mostly on two things. Brought some pictures, some of my artwork. This is a picture of an Egyptian chariot, a war chariot, and it's painted on papyrus. If you had bibliology with me in the college level, you saw papyrus, and you know it's made from plants and weaving together the fibers of those plants that grow in the Nile. But this is a picture of a chariot very much like those that would have run down Moses in the wilderness when he was running from Pharaoh and the great Exodus story. Bought this next to the Great Pyramids, and it's just a reminder that in the Egyptian world, papyrus is a really big deal. They have built back in ancient times their culture around papyrus and how they could communicate with papyrus, and that's going to come into our story of the Bible. Papyrus is a big deal, and it was plentiful. You could cut it by the river. If you knew the process, you could make that. I asked the guy at the Papyrus Museum in Cairo, so how long will papyrus last? And he looked at me like, are you crazy? Like thousands of years, obviously. And so when we're talking bibliology, we're talking about manuscripts that are thousands of years old. And because of the dryness of Egypt, that papyrus lasts and lasts and lasts. So with ancient manuscripts, ancient Greek manuscripts, we're talking about some of them are produced on papyrus. The others are produced on parchment, which is animal skin, sometimes made from calves or sheep or goats, sometimes other animals, deer or wild animals. You could use different skins, but it would take many animals to produce a book. As you learned in the college level bibliology, many animals would die just to produce one book. But we're going to talk for a few minutes. I'm going to show you the greatest parchment book ever made. And Lord willing, in a couple of months in London, you're going to see two awesome parchment Bibles, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Alexandrinus. That's probably the best and the third best Bibles in the world, or most significant. So we're going to look at one of those this afternoon here on our video. So think papyrus. I want to invite you to go with me mentally back to Egypt. My son Andrew lived there, and I went over and toured with him, and we had the amazing experience of traveling up and down the Nile and going to some of the historic places. If you were to imagine, and you've seen maps, the delta of the Nile River flares out. It's very green because of the water and the flooding, and things grow there, and they grow cotton and food, and that's the land of Goshen. It's a great land where the descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob flourished and became a nation that Moses led out of Egypt. A very fertile area, but you come down the river. When I went to Egypt, what struck me most that I had not been aware of before about the country were the canals. There are canals everywhere, flowing water. There's a canal that runs from Cairo over to Suez. There was an ancient canal there in Moses' day, and I think that created the trap where Moses was boxed in by the Egyptians waiting to be delivered, and God parted the waters there in that canal. If you go down the Nile River south, down the map, I should have had a marker board. If you go down the Nile south, below Cairo, you come to a point where a canal was built. It's called, some people call it the Canal of Joseph. Joseph in the book of Genesis, way predating the days of Moses. And Joseph, we know from Genesis, ruled over Egypt for a season for Pharaoh. And there was a lot of engineering, and a canal was run off of that, and it flooded Nile waters over to the west into a place called the Fayum. It's spelled several different ways, but like F-A-Y-U-M, the Fayum. Sort of a spade-shaped green spot you can see on Google Maps or in a Bible atlas. If you were to go down the Nile and up that canal into the Fayum, you'd find a mass of people, and there have been people living there since the days of Moses, way back into early biblical times. That became a site where many early Christians lived 2,000 years ago. And those Christians, and their love for Scripture, produced papyrus paper out of the Nile waters, made that paper, and copied the Scriptures over and over and over. So some of the very best manuscripts we have of the ancient New Testament come from the Fayum and along the Nile riverbed and on up into Cairo, that region where Christians were involved in the process of duplicating especially New Testament documents, other things also. In the last century, many of those were discovered still intact, remarkably intact after 2,000 years of being there in the very, very dry Egyptian climate. So I want to show you a few things from that and talk about that a bit. In your Greek New Testament, those of you that have looked at a Greek New Testament and paid attention, or you may remember from a previous class, we talked about the very papyrus documents, or the papyri, and they were assigned numbers, like P1, P2, P46, P52. We talked about P52 in a previous class that goes back almost to the time of John. It's from the Gospel of John, and whoever copied P52 perhaps even knew John. He was within probably a half generation of the latter days of the Apostle John, who wrote the book of John. I have with me here, and I'm not going to bring it to Zambia, but this is a book on P46. But you can just see it's page after page of P46, which was found in the Fayum. It has many of the epistles of the Apostle Paul and the book of Hebrews. That may be an argument for Paul's authorship of the book of Hebrews. It's an interesting thing to consider in light of some other things that we'll talk about in this course. And in the ordering of the books in P46, this ancient Bible, partial Bible, it's the book of Romans, the book of Hebrews, the book of 1 Corinthians, and then it goes on to 2 Corinthians and several other of the Pauline books. So whoever assembled P46 in that manuscript wove that in to the collection of Paul's writings. So just something to think about there. But you can see, and here's a little sample I've stuck in there of a piece of papyrus. You can see it's very tough, very durable, and you can write on it on both sides, and it'll last in dry climate for thousands of years. It's really remarkable. It's a little bumpy, a little bit rough, but they were able to work with that fairly well and produce documents like P46 or P52 and these other things that we have talked about and will talk about. But those are papyrus Greek manuscripts. The more enduring manuscripts are on parchment or animal skin or hides. In my travel to Egypt, had the amazing experience of going down into the Sinai Peninsula, about 7 hours drive from the city of Cairo. Andrew and I climbed the Mount of Moses, Jebel Musa, the Muslims call it, or Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb, also in the Old Testament, this remarkable mountain. And I have a picture here to show you of that. I've got a couple of pictures. There's a Scottish artist in the 1800s, David Roberts. He was the national artist for the British world. And he did about 200 different paintings like this between Egypt and the Holy Land. And this one depicts a structure I'm going to talk about down here at the base. But these are the mountains, and Jebel Musa is really beyond this and even higher than what you see in this picture. Maybe we can get an up-close shot of that a little later with a little more clarity. But that's the region in the very, very, very dry Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, where Moses led the people from the Egyptians into the wilderness and eventually on to the Promised Land. This picture here is also a David Roberts picture from the Sinai, and this is a stairwell that was etched by monks at a later time ascending Jebel Musa, the mountain of Moses, or Mount Sinai. Well, that's really important for us when we come to the consideration of the most important, at least, or one of the two most important Greek manuscripts in the world. To me, if I had to say what's the most important Bible in the world, I would say it is Codex. Codex, C-O-D-E-X, means book, and Codex Sinaiticus was found in the Sinai by a guy named Constantine van Tischendorf. He went there as an Indiana Jones type character, an explorer, looking. He's a Bible scholar and a Bible translator, an explorer, and he went down into the Sinai looking for manuscripts. He made 3 trips at least into the Sinai, made his way down to the mountain of Moses and to this monastery that's at the base there. St. Catherine's Monastery that's been there for about 1,700 years. He got to know the priest that lived there, the missionary monks that were residents of that location. They have their own chapel in the walls and their own library. And he befriended them really with the hope of seeing what they had in the library, what manuscripts might be there. He, on his second trip, purchased a few pages, but had the feeling there was something more. On his final trip there, he went in and had a long afternoon with one of the monks that lived there. And they went for a long walk and talked about all kind of things, got to be close friends. And upon returning back to St. Catherine's, the fellow said, "You know, I have one other thing to show you. I have a Septuagint also," meaning an Old Testament in the Greek language. And when they went back into the library and started pulling out parchment papers, out came this remarkable manuscript of the Bible, which is Codex Sinaiticus. This book weighs probably about 30 pounds. It's a giant of a book, so it's obviously not coming to Zambia, but you can see it's massive, and it's a photo reproduction of Codex Sinaiticus. And you see page by page how massive this work is, and it was preserved almost perfectly down there in the Sinai at St. Catherine's. Tischendorf purchased that, returned to Germany with it, gave it to the Tsar of Russia, who was a believer, a Christian at the time. It remained there until the communist world took over Russia. They had no respect for the Bible. It was of no particular value to them, and they needed the money. With the failure of their communistic system, they needed the money. And so they sold that manuscript to the British people and to the British Museum and the British Library. That transferred, and now it's been since then in a glass case, air-conditioned control case that, Lord willing, you'll see in a couple of months. And it's on display there, the greatest manuscript. And when you read a New American Standard Bible or an NIV Bible or virtually any of the modern translations, the quality translations of today, they are largely based on Codex Sinaiticus, or the book from the Sinai, this parchment document that Tischendorf brought out of there. So this is a sample of one page, and Gil can get a better picture of this later and weave it in. If you look at it carefully, There's no spacing between words or sentences. All the letters are capital letters. It's very challenging to read. You'd have to study and get used to the process of even reading from this. But all these, with big margins around the outside, the letters are jammed in these 4 parallel columns. And the chapters from the wisdom books, they go to a little bit of a different format with double columns instead of 4 parallel columns. But it's very tight and condensed, and still it results, because parchment's thicker than our paper, it results in a big, massive book, even packed in like that with no spacing. So that's Codex Sinaiticus. It's the foundation, along with Codex Vaticanus. And it is the foundation of modern Bible translation, supplemented by documents like P46 and the ancient papyri that can be compared to the great parchment manuscripts as you do your textual analysis of different passages of the New Testament. So that's a little bit of show and tell about ancient Greek manuscripts. There are almost 6,000, ranging from P52, that's about the size of my hand, and it's shaped about like my hand, and it's got 2 passages from the book of John on each side. That's all you've got with P52. You've got, when you talk about the 6,000, it ranges from that all the way up to Codex Sinaiticus, which has massive portions of the Old Testament, all the New Testament, and a couple of other pieces of Christian literature, all in that one binding now. So there's just a great riches of manuscript evidence for the Christian church that way surpasses anything else historical. There's no close second to any historical document that has that many manuscripts that are that old and that good. Codex Sinaiticus is in virtual mint condition, going back to the 300s. Somewhere in the 300s it was produced and perfectly preserved. God providentially allowed it to be preserved there in that monastery in the Sinai Peninsula and resurfaced in the 1800s when Tischendorf went down there and purchased that. So we'll look at some other things, and I look forward to talking about the details of some of what I've shown you here more in class when we're there in Zambia. And so we'll close this session up here and move on to another topic.